our first panel, and I would like to introduce Nana Jo Endo, the moderator of the panel Documenting Human Rights Violations Worldwide. A human rights activist, a storyteller, and gender equality specialist, Nana Jo is the founder and executive director of the African Network Against Extrajudicial Killings and Enforced Disappearance, known as ANECET, in the Gambia, a civil society organization that combines the power of technology, storytelling, traditional media, and legal expertise to make issues related to enforced disappearances and extrajudicial killings much more visible, advocating for justice for victims and their families. Nana Jo is also one of the initiators of the Jammeh to Justice campaign, which seeks to bring Yahya Jammeh, the former Gambian dictator, and his accomplices to justice. She has worked for various NGOs and international organizations in different countries like Europe, South America, West Africa, and North America over the past 10 years, and speaks English, French, Spanish, as well as Portuguese fluently. Passionate about justice, women's empowerment, and the expression of the socio-political identity of Black people around the world, Nana Jo is encouraged by those who have the courage to speak their truth. Nana Jo, it's great to have you here with us moderating the panel. I'll let you take the lead now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elena, for this, Sylvia, for this introduction. Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be here. I will be your moderator for the next session, which is called Documenting Human Rights Violations Worldwide. The session will provide an overview of the role of documentation in protecting human rights through the experiences and work of 3 sites of conscience. And I have to admit, for someone working on documenting human rights violations, I'm very excited to hear what our stellar panelists have to say. I'm sure this will be very informative for us all today. So I just wanted to briefly give you again, a few reminders just to make sure that you turn off your microphones during the discussion. And at the end of the presentations, there will be 3 presentations. There will be a 10-minute Q&A session, so you'll have time to ask any questions that you have. And again, as you're aware, we have simultaneous translation in Spanish, Arabic, French, and English. So please choose your preferred language. Sylvia, I just wanted to know as well quickly if the virtual flip charts, how they work, had already been explained.
Yeah. They've been explained first thing.
Perfect. So I don't have to do it. Please feel free to do it, to use them. I tried, and I think it's quite user-friendly and straightforward. So I want to start by saying that before I got into this line of work, if I had been asked what human rights violations documentation was and entailed, I would have naively responded that it is just recording accurately human rights violations. Full stop. That's how simple I would have responded. And then I've come to understand that it's much more. It can be a powerful tool in knowledge production, societal contestation, education on human rights abuses, and the importance of fighting impunity, including different voices, furthering specific transitional justice mechanisms, such as the use of archives for the evidentiary foundation in criminal trials. It could be a powerful tool for in advocating for victims, and a complementary way of dealing with the past, in addition to other transitional justice mechanisms and preserving memory. On that last one, I just want to share a brief anecdote with you. Jerry John Rawlings, the former president of Ghana, recently died, and he had ruled for 20 years after coming into power in 1981 through a coup. He came in power through a coup. So his death and legacy seems to have polarized Ghana. And while he modeled himself as opposed to corruption, and many accredit him as the voice of the people, under his military rule, heads of state, other high-ranking officials were executed, market women were blamed for an economic crisis, some publicly flogged, there were extrajudicial killings, including of judges, people were jailed over corruption allegations, detained incommunicado, disappeared or tortured. Yet, 7 days of national mourning was ordered in Ghana when his death was announced. And a friend of mine messaged me saying, I'm so shocked by the amnesia. He was not a hero in my house at all. And as a matter of fact, in many families who were torn apart. So that's a huge question that is sort of starting a debate a bit, is how did we get here? I mean, Ghana did have a National Reconciliation Commission, and it looked at the human rights abuses under the Rawlings regime. So I think this is a question that highlights the complexity of documentation, how it's used, or how it's done, how it's used, and how, you know, it's also available. Moving on, I think, you know, we have three different panelists. They come from very different backgrounds and different regions from the world. Highlight these complexities. So I'd like to first introduce our first speaker, which is, her name is Sophia Brotean-Kaiser. Sophia, I hope I said your name correctly and I haven't butchered it. And she represents the Memoriam Nuremberg trials, where she works as a research associate. Her focus is on education, facilitation, and inclusion. And she has a background in political science and sociology, and human rights and humanitarian law. So before working at the Memoriam Nuremberg trials, she worked at the Human Rights Office of the city of Nuremberg. Sophia, over to you now.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for this introduction. Actually, my last name is pronounced Brostean-Kaiser, but this is really, really hard to do, so just call me Sophie and I will be very fine with that. Yeah, hello everybody, and good morning from Germany, or good afternoon to wherever you are right now. I had prepared a PowerPoint presentation. Can you see them? It's already there. Okay, great. So yeah, good morning. The Memoriam Nuremberg Trials is an information and documentation center. Courtroom 600, that is the room in which the trials were held, is at the heart of our exhibition. In the exhibition, we inform about the Nuremberg trials, the subsequent trials, and international criminal law today. Before I go more into detail here and before I start telling you about it, I would first like to thank Sylvia and Elena and all those people I don't know personally for organizing this event and for doing that. Thank you very much, and also for inviting me today. Yeah. In these 15 minutes that I have today, I would like to focus on the historic event of the Nuremberg trials, and I will speak a little bit about the development of international criminal law today. I know this is quite ambitious, and therefore I will just start right into it. Oh yeah, next slide is already there, thank you. We begin our story in 1945. On the 7th of May, the German Wehrmacht, the German military, surrendered officially, and 1 day later was the end of World War II in Europe. It took, however, a little bit longer for other parts of the world. Japan surrendered on 2nd September in 1945. The war ended with approximately 60 million dead people. Unspeakable crimes were committed during the war. Hitler Germany brought unimaginable pain and horror to the world. I don't have to go into any details here, you all know that. The question is, where do we go from here? How do you deal with Germany, a country that has yet started another world war? Next slide, please. Yeah. So long story short, one answer to this question is the so-called Nuremberg trials. The first and most famous one is the Nuremberg Major War Criminals Trial, which was opened on November 20th, 1945 and lasted almost a year until October 1946. The four Allied powers, the USA, Soviet Union, France, and the UK, cooperated and worked together in order to create this International Military Tribunal. So International Military Tribunal is, sometimes I say IMT, and I mean this Major War Criminals Trial. However, that was not the only one. The IMT was followed by 12 subsequent trials from 1945 to 1949. And all of these trials were held in Courtroom 600 in the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg. It was for the first time in history that high-ranking representatives of a state had to answer for their crimes in a court. So something like this has never happened before in world. Next slide, please. I think you skipped one, but it doesn't matter. Okay. No, can you go back, please? And no, back the other way. And one back. Okay. There was another one. Okay, doesn't matter. Sorry for the confusion. What do you need in order to have a successful and fair trial? I mean, which roles and persons do you need? And one of those that you need are obviously judges. What you can see here is a picture of the judges. As I mentioned before, the IMT was only possible because there was a cooperation between those four Allied powers. They all worked together in order to realize it. And so all of them provided at least one judge. They sit in front of their flags, and they also provided another deputy judge just in case something would have happened. So those 8 men you see behind there on the background, those are the judges. Next slide, please. And here is a picture of the president. His name was Sir Geoffrey Lawrence. He's seated at the center. Next slide, please. So when you have a court and a trial, of course, you need defendants. And the defendants, they are those famous Nazis. All of them were representatives of a state. When you look at the picture, you see at the very background those guards with the white helmets. They are their standing guard. In front of them, on those 2 lines, that's the defendant sitting here in the dock. Some of them really took it as an insult that they were tried as ordinary men before a court. In front of the defendants, you have the defense lawyers. I'll come to them later. There's always some confusion with the numbers. There was a list of 24 defendants, though at the end it was only 21 persons being in court. So what happened to those 3? One of them was dismissed due to incompetence to stand trial. Another one, Martin Bormann, the trial against him was held in absentia. He was already dead at the moment, but the Allied powers did not know that. So they still hoped that they would catch him. And the third one committed suicide before trial. So this is the thing with those 3 people. Then there are 3 people who were not on the dock at all. That was Hitler, Himmler, and Goebbels. All of them had committed suicide at the end of the war. Next slide, please. So, it was not only people as alleged perpetrators before the IMT, but also organizations. Indictment were also entered against these organizations that are listed here. Next slide, please. When we talk about indictments, of course, you need to have indictments for this court. The following indictments were agreed upon in the London Charter. The London Charter is a document which was basically the basis for the IMT. All of the Allied powers had signed it, and some other states. We had 4 indictments at the Nuremberg trials. The first one, common plan or conspiracy. The second one, crimes against peace. The third one, war crimes. And the fourth one, crimes against humanity. Some of these indictments might sound familiar to you. War crimes, for example, is indeed or was already established as a charge even before the Nuremberg trials. Crimes against humanity, however, which is quite common today in international criminal law, was used here for the first time in Nuremberg. Next slide, please. We already talked about them. Essentially, for a fair trial is to have defense lawyers. Here you can see one of them preparing for court, and I think it's very important to point out here that the Allied powers really took it seriously to have a fair trial. So each defendant was entitled to a defense lawyer to help them and to represent them in court. Next slide, please. All in all, there were 4 prosecution teams. Again, 1 prosecution team for each Allied power, and each dealing with one of the indictments. So their job was it to lay out what each of the defendant was accused of. We had individual indictments for each defendant. And on this picture here, you can see Robert H. Jackson. He was chief American prosecutor, and that is when he was opening the trial. So he's a very important person. We'll come back to him later. Next slide, please. Yeah, the interpreters, we already talked about them today a little bit. They are so important. Without interpreters, the IMT would not have been possible. As we can see today on this online conference, today it is very, very common to have simultaneous interpretation in several languages at once for large international meetings. The reasons for that are obvious. Everybody has the same information at once, and there's no delay in time that you have as you would have with consecutive interpretation. The birthplace of simultaneous interpretation was indeed the Nuremberg trials. So that was for the first time that proceedings were translated simultaneously into different languages. They used the language German, English, Russian, and France. And on this picture here, you can see there's men and women working there. We had always teams of 3 people and shifts up to 4 or 5 hours. So that was really, really hard job. By the way, thanks to the translators at this point. Next slide, please. Yeah. So this is the part which I guess is most important for this topic in this panel and for the conference here, the evidence. You cannot have a trial and accuse people of crimes without presenting any evidence to that, and therefore you need the documentation. The crimes of the Nazis were numerous and unspeakable. However, in a court, you have to be very precise. You have to name dates, you have to name places, you have to name the names of those people who committed or allegedly committed the crimes. You need to show evidence how certain incidents might have happened. And so a lot of knowledge that we have today about the crimes of the Nazis is because of the work of the Nuremberg trials. Another first time, it was also for the first time that film as evidence were authorized in court. All in all, they showed 3 films. One of them is the quite famous liberation of the Nazi camps. Furthermore, more than 4,000 documents as evidence made their way into court. We speak about things as written orders, things as a chain of command or personal letters. They also were used. And all these more than 4,000 documents were translated in the 4 languages. So now you can guess how much work they put into that. In addition to this, there were more than 1,000 affidavits. An affidavit is a written explanation, so you did not have all those witnesses in court. You did not have 1,000 people extra there. Nevertheless, we had all in all 139 witnesses in court giving their testimony, and they were nominated by both sides. So the prosecution and the defense could nominate witnesses. Yeah. Next slide, please. Just to close the story, after almost a year, the judges came to the following verdict. We had 12 death penalties, 3 lifelong sentences, 4 long prison sentences, and 3 acquittals. Next slide, please. This quote is by Chief Prosecutor Robert H. Jackson. We have talked about him before, and it shows the aims and the moral aspirations of the IMT. that 4 great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury, stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of the law, is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason. Next slide, please. And next one, we skipped that. Thank you. Yeah, the subsequent trials. I'll be quick. The story wasn't over with the verdicts from the IMT. It was certainly not enough to sentence just 21%. The 12 subsequent trials were all held in the same courtroom 600, but it was an international corporation. It was not international corporation anymore. It was just a US military court. Those 12 trials were held between 1946 and 1949 in Nuremberg, and all in all, 177 high-ranking people were tried there. The trials revealed the extent to which the German leadership class supported the power and system of the Nazi dictatorship. Next slide, please. And the next one. Yeah. So, of course, there is much more to say about German history and how the legal prosecution of the Nazis went on and how much was not done. But this is not a topic today. So as promised, I will now skip a lot of developments. And now we jump in the 1990s to the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. So when we look at the development of international criminal law, first, we had the IMT in Nuremberg. Again, for the first time that high-ranking people of a state were taken to trial. And then for a long time, nothing happened. So the next step was the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, the ICTY, which lasted until 2017. Next slide, please. I'm almost done. Almost parallel to the ICTY was the ICTR, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. So these two tribunals were created by the Security Council of the United Nations. Next slide, please. And this is the last one too, so I'm almost done with my 15 minutes. In 2002, the ICC, the International Criminal Court, came into force. And as with any other court, it only can act if there's documentation of crimes, of abuses, or of human rights violations. The fact that we have the ICC today is a great success. You can say a lot about the ICC and how successful or not successful its work is, and it's certainly not perfect. There is much to improve. Nevertheless, just the fact that it exists and that at least some people are held accountable for the crimes is a success today. However, and I would like to close with this, legal prosecution of crimes is just one aspect out of many others when it comes to why documentation of human rights violation is so important today. And I'm sure we will hear much more about these other aspects from the other panelists and during this meeting. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Sophia. This was very interesting. And I actually do have a few questions for the end. But in the meantime, what we're going to do is move on to the next presentation. And the next person that will be speaking is Fadel Abdulghani. And he is the founder and head of the Syrian Network for Human Rights. The Syrian Network for Human Rights was founded in June 2011. I hope that's correct. And it's been going on to date. Over the past 10 years, Fadel has advocated for human rights through managing the Syrian Network for Human Rights. So it's also known as its acronym SNHR. And by doing so via hundreds of investigations on human rights violations, as well as participating in the writing of hundreds of reports and investigations and researches. Fadel comes with a breadth of experience, including speaking at many international events, including the UN Security Council and Human Rights Council. He also worked as an independent consultant in human rights file to provide counsel to the Syrian opposition's convoy during several peace negotiations meetings in Geneva. He has also trained tens of the leaders of the political offices of the armed opposition on the rule on international customary law, and has written many opinion articles, reports, or participated in putting together reports and researches with local, regional, and international organizations, other than his work with the organization he's heading. So Fadel, on this note, I will let you take the floor.
Thank you very much indeed for the organization of this essential event and for having me. I would like to talk about our experience in Syria for now past almost 10 years. And how our organization documenting the violation in this extraordinary situation in Syria, and how it's developed, and how the methodology being changed due to some examples. I think like maybe based on this event or based on this essay, which I written, and I hope this will publish soon, like we can move ahead and talk about specific and handle about specific topic like Caesar files or chemical weapons or barrel bombs or torture. But like I would like to start and give a wide range of the documentation in Syria and how it's difficult and yeah, is it okay now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. So I think that the essay is talking a bit in general, giving an example of extrajudicial killing, which is almost match the process of the extrajudicial killing documentation is almost match other types of violation. SNHR is documenting wide range of violation, including arbitrary detention, disappearance, torture, destruction, random killing and displacement, and other types of violation. And we are keen to include the women and children, and we have like in all of our report and statistic, and we have a like type of partnership with UNICEF in this regard. So I'll start in my essay, and I hope it can be circulated to our coalition member. Civilian casualties have fallen since the early days of the popular uprising in March 2011. Security services responded to a peaceful demonstration with a direct live gunfire and killed and wounding a lot of Syrian citizens. I'll talk in 5 main aspects. So I'll talk briefly about the initial stages. Then I'll talk about how we relied on the electronic programs, and how is then due to the entry of multiple parties to the conflict, the development of SNHR methodology. Then the 4th point is the most notable challenges, and the 5th one is about the evidence presented by SNHR, and this is type of the advocacy. So the initial stage and you was right. The organization is established in June 2011. It's a bit delayed, but because the idea was not in my mind until like I tried several times to contact with the previous activists in Syria or local organization, but I didn't notice that there is a periodic report or following up or accumulative work. Cumulative work meaning to build a center database and to work cumulatively and to follow up all of those. So SNHR possesses a huge database of those violations and categorize this database. So SNHR established in June 2011, and at this stage, my object is setting up the SNHR to accurately document the killing, to circulate this information to various media outlets and some international bodies in an effort to communicate verified data documented with the greatest accuracy and professionalism. So that will enable the international community, in particular the civilized countries, and the United Nations to build up on this and to protect the civilians, stop the killing and the violation which is reached to crimes against humanity, as the United Nations mentioned in all of the Commission of Inquiry report, especially the first report. So the progress of building the team, which is initially consisted mostly on volunteers at the initial stage, was based on a direct relationship and communication. And from a very first day, I tried to take into account the geographical distribution process, especially focused on the hot provinces or hot location, where is the demonstration taking place. Why is that? Because the main violation at that period was committed against those protesters, or raiding their houses, or follow up them where they hiding and kill them, or arrest them and then committed torture, or they being disappeared. So I'll not like speaking a lot about this. So I hope that due to the time, the 15 minutes, I think it's not enough because it's about 14 pages. Like after so we collecting data from our team members, the volunteers, which is each of those are linked to and build a relationship with the eyewitnesses, with the families, and actually the relation built based on the violation. I mean the violation areas. When a violation taking place in some areas, so we run after this violation, and based on that we build contact. Then we have the verification process, which is built based on the organization hierarchy. So there is a field researcher, then there is, like above of this field researcher, there is the head of each department, the casualties department, and then we have the detainees department, and we have also the report department and the women and the children department, which is enable us actually to continue and to, I can say, gain the trust of the community, is SNHR is keep publishing a daily casualties report and publishing, then developed to publish a monthly report, then published a thematic report, and being covered well by the Arabic and the local media. So the community is heard about us and start also at this. So we moved now from the first stage, which we are following the news, and now we are getting news, we're receiving. So we became a well-known, a bit well-known, better than when we established, and that actually cumulatively increased due to continuous work and due to also our daily basis following up. And quoting SNHR by the UN, mainly the High Commissioner, and by other international human rights organizations, also giving us a high level of credibility in front of our community, which was our main concern at this stages. Moving ahead, actually, there is a list of how we documented, and a list of how we verified the news in our methodology, and the photos, all of that. The key point in this regard is the expandination of relationship with the victims and the survivals. And as possible as we can, we need to have this variety because we want to get information mainly from two different sources, which is sometimes is difficult. Sometimes we are getting even about one incident, mainly if it's a big incident. So there is a lot of testimony, massacres taking place, or riding for the neighborhoods. So we used to take more than two. Sometimes it's reached actually is the one which we believe or thought that this is somehow accurate. So we, based on the methodology, we record this in database. Actually, SNHR build from zero and expand. So we used to work manually and build a daily Word files of the list of casualties written manually, actually, and named by the day of the name. But by expandination of the violation, which is the uprising in Syria moved from territory, province to other province and cities, based on this expandination of the uprising, the violation also expanded. So the manual work became actually very difficult. So we move ahead toward the technical program, and we build a complex technical program which has enabled us to store all of those Word files automatically in the program. The program read those programs built on MySQL language, and we don't need any more to enter the data in or the files in the data. The program is reading those files and automatically store it and distribute it based on the province, gender, types of violation, and the program also enable us to extract those whatever we want based on on which day or area or which type of violations. The program also enable us to do that. But like manual work is, that doesn't mean that the manual work is not required anymore. Of course, we need to build those files manually and to written each cases in a language program way. Let's see one message. Okay, 5 minutes. 5 minutes is very okay. I'll jump. So the main difficulties actually is that several parties engage in, and this is one example of the difficulties and challenging in the Syria conflicts. At the beginning, there was only Assad regime, the Syrian regime, and the regime itself hired tremendous amount of local militias, and then hired also and bring the Iranian militias as well, Hezbollah. So all of those categorized as Syrian regime forces. Then we have the opposition forces, which is established in by end of 2011. Then the extremist group entered the conflict, Al-Nusra Front, but at the early stage of 2012. ISIS actually, after more than 2 years, established in Syria, after the more than 2 years from the beginning. Then we have the PYD, the Democratic Union Party, which is the branch of the Kurdistan Worker Parties, PKK. We have also then in September 2014, the coalition led by the US, coalition against ISIS. Then in September 2015, we have the Russian forces. Then also we have the Turkish forces in 2016. All of those parties actually make the documentation is further complicated. SNHR is trying always to assign to attribute the incident to those who's responsible about it. So that's sometimes make it difficult for us, especially when, for example, at the same time, the Russian forces and the regime waging like the air forces of both of them waging an attack against a neighborhood. So each one of those committed this. Sometimes it's difficult actually. I'll move to the final stage. Then I'll maybe due to the time, I leave some sort of let's say for the question, but like I want to refer that due to the long time of the conflict, now it's almost 10 years without any types of accountability of the high scale of violation which is reached to crimes against humanity and war crimes as well. That lead to the deep frustration in between the Syrian community. So they are like faithless about the documentation process. without cooperation from the primary source, which is the families themselves, the documentation will be so difficult, actually. So I think we need to rethink about how we build a faith of the documentation process. We always talking about archiving the history of the Syria and not changing the narrative as the dictatorship want to do that. The final one, which I want to highlight, is which is the advocating point. SNHR actually one of the main source of the United Nations, especially in their analysis in casualties in Syria. Also engaged in almost all of the Commission of Inquiry reports. We have an agreement with the OPCW in their investigation about chemical weapons. We have a partnership with UNICEF providing data from our documented cases on the violations against the children. We have also other partnership with an international organization, not only with the UN. That enable us to reflect our database on the report, not reports published by us. We have 3 monthly reports, one about casualties, one about casualties in the previous months, one about the detention and the disappearance, and the third one is talking about the general and all different types of violation and the general conditions of the human rights violation in the previous months. But also we have after those 3 monthly reports, we have a thematic report in each month highlighting different suffering of our community, trying to reach out to the decision makers and via those documented reports. I hope that this very quick introduction about our work is sufficient, and I'm open for any question. Thank you very much again.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Fadel. There's certainly a lot of information that you shared with us. May I also ask if you could share your email address in case others want to contact you directly? And actually, Sophia, I forgot to ask you to do the same. If you could just put it in the chat box, it would be great, so that if anybody has any questions or would like to learn more about your work, they can follow up as well privately. So we were supposed to have rural communities for nearly 1 decade. He has also been a consultant in transitional justice for several international donors in the implementation of the Colombian peace process, and has extensively participated in promoting memorialization initiatives in the Latin America region. So before joining the coalition as a staff member, he actively contributed to the Coalition Latin America and Caribbean Network and led the Global Initiative for Justice, Truth and Reconciliations program, supporting truth, justice and reconciliation in Colombia, which was focused on strengthening participatory processes with the Truth Commission and the Unit for Searching the Disappeared. So Dario is going to come now, and he will speak to us about the general context of the Colombia conflict, plus the role of civil society in documenting human rights in Colombia. Dario, over to you now.
Thanks so much, Nana Jo. I'm happy to address this audience of Asian members and other members across the world. This is a very exciting opportunity. Unfortunately, we couldn't have Jose Antequera to present the case of one of our member sites in Latin America and the Center for Memory, Peace and Reconciliation. However, I would like to provide some general context information about the documentation process in Colombia. As we have in the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience, we have a program in Colombia in the Global Initiative for Justice, Truth and Reconciliation. And our program in Colombia is supporting the current peace process and the implementation of the transitional justice process. So I would like to share some thoughts and reflections on the role of civil society documentation in all this process, in documenting human rights throughout 60 years of armed conflict, and also the role of civil society documentation in the current transitional justice process in Colombia. So as a general overview of the Colombian context, the armed conflict started in 1948, and then there have been several failed attempts to finalize the conflict through peace agreements, and over the decades, civil society has been organizing at a very patient pace but very structured, with a very structured methodology, because, well, it has been already 60 years of this process of documenting. And then by the 80s, civil society organizations developed very robust databases of human rights violations. And but just to understand what this means in the general context, I would like to mention that the attempts for peace processes in the past have been partially successful. In the first attempt was in 1958, when the guerrillas were demobilized, and the peace process was apparently going to work, and but there were paramilitaries supporting the conservative government of that time, which took this opportunity to try to annihilate the former combatants and the social basis of the guerrilla movement. So what happened there was that they initiated again a cycle of massacres, and the demobilized guerrilla took arms again, and they became a very strong rural guerrilla. And by that time, it was coincident with the Cuban Revolution. So there was a transformation of the contents, of the general contents, or the general platform of the guerrilla, into a Marxist movement. And the guerrilla was then split into several movements. So we ended up with many guerrilla movements, most of them of Marxist ideology, in the 70s. And there were other failed attempts to bring this conflict to an end. But then in the 90s, in 1992, more precisely, there was a peace agreement with most of these guerrilla groups, which produced the constitutional reform. The constitutional reform came as a result of that agreement through an assembly, constitutional assembly, which developed the current Colombian constitution, including many ethnic groups and also the former combatants in the discussions of the terms of this constitution. So that process seemed to be very successful, but unfortunately it left out a couple of very significant guerrilla groups, namely the FARC guerrilla and the ELN, which are still well, part of the equation of the current process. I will get to that in a minute. But then what happened there is that the paramilitaries were particularly supported by drug barons, produced or developed very sophisticated armed groups in principle to combat the guerrilla movements, but also to they had a strategy of mass killings and destruction against and confinement against the populations in the areas where the guerrilla was had their strongholds. So what happened there is that the rural communities ended up being victimized by the guerrilla, by the paramilitaries, by the army, and many other sites. Well, there were maybe a dozen armed groups, and that situation escalated through the 90s until finally, well, that brings us to the more recent initiatives of or attempts to bring this conflict to an end, with the negotiation with the FARC guerrilla, the largest one in Colombia, and which ended in the partial demobilization. And what the guerrilla did was establish political alliances with opposition groups to participate in the elections, in the local the local elections of mayors and governors, and the Senate and the House of Representatives, and they were able to get to many of these positions because they had a strong popular support. But then what happened there was that the paramilitaries organized a systematic killing of the leaders of this movement, of congressmen and presidential candidates. And so the intention of the paramilitaries was to completely annihilate this opposition. And so the FARC guerrilla went back to taking to the warring position. They took arms again, and the cycle started again. So from that time to the present, civil society has developed very sophisticated methodologies and work groups to collect documentation and to do it in a very systematic and structured way. Some of these civil society organizations were started as litigating offices against human rights violations by government officials or by paramilitaries and the guerrilla, and but then they finally collected very relevant information as litigating organizations, and in a context where we had over 2 million displaced people and more than 80,000 disappeared persons. And for example, in the case of the disappeared, ASFADES, the Association of Families of the Disappeared, documented thousands of these disappearances with a very detailed documentation and procedure in preparation for international courts. Also, Reiniciar collected information about the persecution against political leaders, and the CINEP, the Center, an institution based in research in a university, developed a network of human rights databases across the country. So there's a lot of documentation that was collected in a very structured and orderly way, learning from mistakes until they reached, after many years, after several decades, this level of a very well articulated basis for several purposes, not only for accountability but also for memorialization, and for advocacy. And what happened there was that civil society developed centers of memory where these organizations would disseminate information and convene public meetings with students and with groups, stakeholders, to give visibility to the human rights violations through, based on their documentation. And these were the most important model for what later came as government initiatives of centers of memory. The first of which was the Center for Memory, Peace and Reconciliation, which was the one that we wanted to introduce here. They are members of our coalition, and the other one was also, they're also members of our coalition, was the Medellin Center for the Museum of Memory of Medellin. And then later on, the National Center for Memory was developed in as a national initiative, but those are state institutions based on the experience of civil society documenting human rights. And the interesting thing here is that at first it was very difficult to put all these different civil society organizations to work jointly, to work together, because some of them had worked under the belief that the other CSOs, the other civil society organizations, justified their perpetrators. So they felt that the victims of the guerrilla felt that the victims of the paramilitary were allied to their perpetrators, so they couldn't even be in the same room. It's something similar to what you can find in Northern Ireland and other contexts for the different sides of the conflict, or of the victims, not of the conflict, because the victims is a very different thing from the sides of the conflict. The different collectives of the victims could not dialogue with each other. But then there was an important process initiated by the Center for Memory of Bogota, which was the example that we wanted to bring, to bring those opposing victims groups to the table to have a direct dialogue. And the strategy behind that is get them to realize that they were after the same humanitarian principles. So I will just jump to the end of this process. We very recently, the government of Colombia reached an agreement with the FARC guerrilla, and they demobilized. That was the largest group. There are still other guerrilla groups in arms, so the process is once again incomplete. But then this time there is a very structured transitional justice institution, or as a number of institutions and mechanisms, the transitional justice mechanisms put in place by this peace agreement, the Truth Commission, the Unit for Searching for the Disappeared, and the Special Jurisdiction for Peace. The Special Jurisdiction for Peace being the only judicial mechanism in the three. The other two are non-judicial. But then we will jump very quickly. We will not go into detail because we don't have time right now, but then we will get back to that in the training and other moments or in other circumstances in this conference. And but the main thing here is that the Truth Commission was able to develop their work or their research based on the documentation that civil society had collected. And the irony behind that is that sometimes the government information, the information that should be found in the government institutions is not available for lack of political will sometimes, but many times because the archives have been destroyed over time. However, civil society has been very carefully collecting these pieces of archives, of official archives throughout the litigation over decades. And then the Truth Commission has had access not only to the sources from civil society, but also official sources through the archives produced by civil society. And so at this moment, many people, many organizations across the country are developing their own documentation strategies to contribute to the Truth Commission. But the main message here, and the most important thing, is that the only really relevant or relevantly useful information for the Truth Commission and for the Special Jurisdiction for Peace is that documentation that has been collected and structured over the years. The groups of civil society organizations and victims associations that started their work of collecting information, documentation in the last 2 years of the mandate of the recent 2 years of the mandate of the Truth Commission came in too late, and developing their expertise and their capacities to structure the information couldn't be deployed on time for the Truth Commission to be able to use that documentation. So the main message here is that it is very important to keep very well structured and robust records and archives in civil society, even if there's no transitional justice process at site in the near future. So I think I took already my time. I won't say much more than that, and let's just see what questions you may have about this. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dario, and my apologies for being strict on time. It's just we're running a bit late. So we're about to start the Q&A session. I see that there is a question that came in from James Yanchan. It's for Fadel, actually. And it's 2 questions regarding the human rights documentation on the ground. So the first one is, what were the most difficult challenges your team or those documenting faced during the documentation processes in affected region? Could you share some of those challenges of your work with us? So Fadel, can you just respond to this question? And then there's another one. Please bear in mind that Sophia has to leave actually in the next 10 minutes. So grateful if you could be brief as well.
Thank you, and thanks for the question. I'll be brief. The most challenging now or difficulties is facing us is the frustration actually from the community and the lack of cooperation. We rely on the victims and on the families actually to share information. Without this, and that actually due to a lack of or due to the vanish of accountability at all, and the continuity of crimes in almost 10 years without any status toward a democratic, respectful countries to the human rights, and the regime want to keep this family ruling Syria for almost more 50 years. Regime without any pressure. I'm giving just a quick example that all of those crimes against humanity committed by the regime, killing above than 200,000 Syrian citizens, torture above than 14,000 Syrian citizens. Those are amount crimes against humanity, displaced half of the population. There is no economic sanction from the UN against the Assad regime, even not a military sanction. So Russia can sell weapons to the regime, even China, any countries. The sanction imposed by democratic countries to the regime, and even those sanctions are not enough at all without a political will to end this disaster conflict. So that's also a very brief due to the request from the moderator.
Thank you so much, Fidel. James, I hope that answered your questions. I see that you have one for Sophia. I actually also had one for Sophia, but I'll let you take. So Sophia, the question from James is, well, James said he appreciates your presentation about the human rights documentation of violations that your organization documented during the Second World War. Based on the process of trial, what was the success of the court in prosecution of war criminals or perpetrators? And may I ask you just briefly as well to just tell us a bit more about the work that you currently do? I think that would actually tie these two together.
Okay, I'll try to do that. Thank you very much for the questions. I'll start with the one from James. Thank you for the question. So what was the success of the IMT of the Nuremberg trials? Well, that's difficult. I think that the trial itself took place was a huge success, that we had this successful cooperation from the 4 allied powers together, that they worked towards this aim was a great thing. Then that the trial actually was just, well, it was almost a year, and it ended with the verdicts. And I think, well, we could talk a lot about if the verdicts were just or unjust, but nevertheless, we had a fair trial, and according to the rule of law, this was a more or less great outcome, I can say. So I hope that answers your question a little bit. I think that we had the verdicts and that the trial took place was the success of the trials. Plus, if you look at today at the development of international criminal law, the fact that there was the ICTY, the ICTR, those tribunals I mentioned before in my presentation, and the ICC today, that was hugely influenced by the trials in Nuremberg. Without them, they wouldn't have happened like they are today. I'm pretty sure about that. Though, just to mention that that's not all. There are other developments in international criminal law today that we did not touch today in the discussion, but there is more to that than just those institutionalized courts. So I hope this answered your question. And to your question, Nana Jo, for the work of the memoriam, well, of course, first of all, we try to inform and to document the Nuremberg trials. As for our visitors, we give them facts, but we do not give them one narrative. This is how the story went, but we want to encourage them to think for themselves, to think critically, and to come to a conclusion for themselves about how things happened. Of course, we do organize also event discussions with different speakers to highlight various aspects of the trials like rule of law or democracy. Of course, we also do offer guided tours through the exhibition. Something that is very important for us in our work, we try very much not to just stick to the historic facts and stick to history, but to always connect these historic incidents to the present and also to the future. What can we learn from that? It's 75 years ago now. What's the influence of the Nuremberg trials today? And I think it's more than just international criminal law today, but also some things, as I mentioned before, with regards to democracy, with regards to human rights, or to the rule of law. So this is something that we always try to work on. Yeah. I hope that has answered all your questions now. And thank you very much again for the invitation, for the opportunity here to talk. If you have any more questions, feel free to write me an email. But I'm very sorry I have to leave now because I have another meeting in a couple of minutes. And therefore, I will just take this opportunity and say goodbye to you all. And thank you very much again.
Thank you so much, Sophia. It was a pleasure to have you with us. And it was very informative what you shared with us today. On this note, actually, we will be ending this session.